in the wrong place?
Nope, you're right.
No,
Welcome
we
to
hear you.
Bugs Need Heroes. You're good.
It sounded like you guys were in the middle of a conversation or something.
Oh yeah, we were just chatting before you got here.
Oh, okay.
No, you're fine.
My last sip of water in.
Get hydrated, Amanda. Get hydrated.
All right. Hello, friends and fiends. Welcome to Bugs Need Heroes, a podcast where an artist and an entomologist team up to illustrate the inspiring abilities of insects by creating a bug-themed superhero. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Kelly.
Producer Derek and his cat Rotunda are also here. Before we get started creating this bug-inspired hero, what's bugging you, Kelly?
Oh, no. I know you hate them, and I have no complaints.
You gotta get on the complaint train with me.
I know. I just had my 10-year wedding anniversary. So very exciting.
I do love.
Yeah. So it's all good news.
You still like him?
I do. I think I'll keep him.
Still keep him around.
He's fantastic. He helps make this podcast happen, which is nice.
Shout out to tolerant husbands who let us disappear for hours at a time.
How about you, Amanda? What's bugging you?
Oh, what's bugging me? I stepped on a nail this week. And it has thrown my whole life off course.
Oh, no.
Because suddenly all the things you do every day are way harder when you can't use one of your feet. Let me just say, it's a bummer. It's a bummer. Don't step on nails. That's what's bugging me this week. Luckily, it went through my heel instead of through the arch of my foot. That would have been a real problem. But
oh gosh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Luckily, I didn't get some horrible disease or anything from a nasty, rusty nail.
No tetanus or
up to date
bacterial
on all my
infections.
Shots. Yeah, that's what I was really worried about, was the bacterial infections, because nails are usually not the cleanest thing on the planet. So don't recommend that. But I've been looking forward to doing this podcast, so I'm doing that now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you're very excited as I am for our guest today.
I love when we have special guests.
Me too. It makes it a lot more fun. So please welcome Dr. Oh, also, I guess Derek is reminding me, this is our 1-year anniversary show, or just about. So
you've been doing this a whole year already? That seems crazy. Yeah. That seems nutsos to me. But I guess it makes sense. I had a fresh baby when we started, and now she's walking around. So timeline, it checks out. It checks out, this timeline.
Well, that makes it even more exciting to have a guest. So welcome to our anniversary show, Dr. Mathias Nordvig, who is a professor of pre-Christian Nordic mythologies and Scandinavian folklore. Dr. Nordvig, welcome to the cast.
Thank you so much. And I'm very sorry to hear that you stepped on a nail, Amanda. That sounds pretty awful.
It sucked. But I'm actually surprised I recovered so quickly. I feel mostly, if I have shoes on, I can walk pretty normal. But that first 2 days where it was it's weird because it hurts in your foot, which on your foot makes sense, but in your foot is a weird sensation in comparison to normal.
Yeah. Ooh.
It's like when you get an itch on your foot, but it's in your foot and it's itchy. I don't know if anyone's seen it before.
It was weird. I didn't enjoy it. I would not recommend. 0 out of 10.
Well, Derek wants to know what day this happened.
It was last Thursday, and today is Tuesday. So it's been a few days.
Okay.
Hasn't quite been a week.
Amanda is not known for her grace and balance.
No, I'm just stumbling around this world. My low center of gravity helps me not fall over. I just step on everything on the way, though. So.
Well, we are super excited today. I guess the show is a little bit different than usual because normally we pick one bug. But Mathias is here to talk to us about insects in general in Nordic mythology. Is there a lot of examples of this?
No. That's the funny thing. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I know of one example where there's a mention of an insect, and that is just like a generic fly, like in the Old Norse language. And then we have another story, which is the story about how Odin gets the meat of poetry, which I think actually can be interpreted in sort of relation to the activity of bees.
Okay.
So
First, sorry, Mathias. First, can you let us know what Nordic is and what part of the world we're discussing for those who are unfamiliar?
You say Nordic, and my brain goes probably
somewhere
Denmark.
north.
Yeah, like through like Sweden and Norway. I call it Scandinavian. But
Scandinavian, yeah, that's a good term. I like that. Yeah, so and that's actually also kind of complicated. So in Scandinavia, we use the term Nordic to refer to anything sort of like north of Germany. So that would be Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland, and Greenland as well. And that's I would say, the most inclusive term, because it doesn't sort of hint at any ethnicities or sort of give primacy to any specific part of that region. The thing is that these different countries, they have a more than 1,000-year-old history together in many different ways. They are culturally overlapping, but there are many different ethnicities and languages being spoken here. For instance, in Greenland, the indigenous population is Inuit, and so that makes them North American. And you have Icelanders who are geographically not, part of Scandinavia, and so we don't call them Scandinavia for that reason, and for other political, cultural reasons. And Finland, it's the same thing, and so on. But they all have a lot in common, so to speak.
Right. We hear the word Norse being used a lot, and not Nordic. What is with that?
Yeah, that's actually a big problem.
Is it?
Yes.
We've stumbled upon discourse.
Yes. Well, okay, so I will give you my Norse rant. I actually have a Norse rant. So the term Norse originates in Danish and Norwegian, and it just means Norwegian. In the 1580s, it was borrowed into English, probably through sailors interacting, as a term for Norway. And then in the 19th century, the scholars who are dealing with what we call Old Norse literature, right? So medieval Icelandic primarily, and secondarily Norwegian literature. They started using the term Old Norse in English to translate the Old Icelandic term Norrein. Norrein is a linguistic distinction that Icelanders came up with in the 1200s to distinguish their language, and also the language spoken on the western Norwegian coast, from, for instance, Danish and Swedish, because they noticed certain linguistic developments that had happened. And so that was in use in the 19th century and 20th century. And now the term Norse has just become anything that has to do with sort of like back in the day in Scandinavia.
Right.
That's actually really problematic, because the for instance, people sort of like conflate Norse and Viking Age.
Yeah.
And Norse is actually the Old Norse language. That language that is Icelandic is called Norrein. It actually develops after the Viking Age in the 1100s. So when we talk about the language that they spoke, for instance, in the Viking Age, we would call that something like, there are different terms for it. Old Nordic, Common Scandinavian. Some also call it Rune Nordic or Rune Danish, Rune Swedish, Rune Norwegian, because it's written in runes. So and nowadays
it's a lot more complicated than I was expecting.
It's just like my problem. It's like my problem with Renaissance fairs in America, where they're like, "Come to the Renaissance fair, dress up," and it's like anything from like 1100 to 1600 is like fair game. I'm like, this is a long time, you guys. A lot of stuff happened in these 500 years,
right? And funky horns, and I don't know what.
Fairy wings.
And I mean, nowadays, scholars have just like thrown caution to the wind. So you can see anybody, archaeologists, historians of religion, all kinds of scholars, whether they're Scandinavian or from somewhere else, they just use the term Norse as sort of like, this is a catch-all for that period up there.
This reminds me of the issue we have in biology as a biologist of taxonomy, where things start to get very specific language-wise, the language we use. Sometimes it's a fly, which is a real general term for anything with 2 wings, like a diptera. And other times it's very specific, it's a mosquito. Right. So yeah, like words have meaning is the issue.
Yeah, and I would say, so my little pet peeve with all of this is that if we use that term Norse to just describe anything up there in that period, then we're also glossing over a lot of ethnic and regional and local identities, right?
Yeah,
and
like the Sami people, right?
The Sami people, also the political differences between Iceland and Norway, for that matter, right? Like, I'm pretty sure Icelanders would like to be considered Icelandic instead of Norwegian.
Yeah. Small difference, right?
Small difference. Right? All those
only an
things,
ocean
right?
between them. It's no big deal.
Right?
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. I'm glad we've cleared that up at least.
Yeah.
So, Kelly, how familiar are you with Nordic mythos, Kelly? Because I only know like the kids' book version of stuff. Like, I know that like Odin plucks out his eye at one point. I know that there's a big tree. I want to say it's called Yggdrasil. No, that's a Lord of the Rings sword.
No,
that's right. Okay.
Yeah.
I know that Freya has a chariot pulled by cats. That sounds right.
Yes. Snorri Sturluson did say that in 1220. Yes.
I know that
you're doing pretty good.
Everyone likes Balder except for Loki, who gets him killed with mistletoe. That's all I know.
All right. Yeah.
That's it.
I'm a big old Nordic
I know you love Thor
nerd.
in the MCU and the Marvel books in general.
Well, very different. Marvel,
very,
Thor,
very different. Yeah. I was gonna ask if how comparable are they? Like, would you?
I mean, they're strong. That's about it. Yeah. And handsome. I guess
they're
that
both
would
strong,
be
handsome fellows who love to hit things with a hammer.
Thor in the mythos they call him a red beard, so I don't think he would look like Chris Hemsworth. But we can dream, I suppose.
Yes. If we recast all mythos, they're all going to be drop dead gorgeous, of course.
Yes. I'm looking at my behind my desk. I have a little shelf space, and I have the Poetic Edda. I have How Thor Lost His Thunder. I have a whole bunch. Thor is my favorite of the Nordic gods, so I have every book I could find on him.
Cool.
But yeah, I'm a bit of a nerd, I guess, in that way. I have Gaiman's comic book adaptions, which are cute. So
we've talked on this podcast about being myth kids for the Greek and Roman, kind of conflated between the two. Being
you grow
mythos
up with
kids
that
way.
Yeah.
Were you a myth kid, Mathias, or did you come into this later?
No, I was definitely a myth kid. I've never encountered that term before, but that actually is very applicable. Yeah, no, but I would say to a degree all Scandinavians are, because we're taught this stuff in school.
Oh, okay, I see.
So it's sort of like the cultural education that we get. Because
when do you learn this in school? When is it, like elementary?
Yeah, it's very early. And I would say probably in 4th or 5th grade is when. So it really depends on the teachers as well. So in Denmark specifically, we actually have a class called Christianity class, because Lutheranism is our state religion. So you have to have Christianity in class, and that is broadly interpreted to also include Nordic mythology.
Really? Oh,
Yes.
okay.
And that has something to do with our history. So back in the 19th century, there was a pretty influential Danish pastor who devised a pedagogy for teaching the general public all kinds of things. And he was like, well, we have to start with Nordic mythology and Viking heroes, of course. So
That's pretty
awesome. So that's still a thing, and this is also the reason other Scandinavians learn about this stuff in school at some point. His pedagogy was adopted in Norway and Sweden and Iceland as well. And
that's so cool.
Yeah,
I'm jealous. I'm very jealous. Yeah.
Well,
So
I mean, sorry. Go ahead.
So our mother's maiden name is Hansen. Well, I'll just tell you. Her full name is Kirsten Hansen. She is
okay.
Her family's Danish. So that's probably the only link to cultural anything as Americans that we really have, is that my mother is Danish. And my grandfather lived probably about a third of his life in Denmark proper.
Okay.
And my mom kind of jumped around between Denmark. She lived in Sweden for a while. So I was just surprised that she doesn't have a lot of this education, but I'm realizing now that she spoke Swedish till she was about 5, and then she moved back to the US and now no longer speaks any German, Swedish, Danish. Because at one point she was like this little polyglot kid, and now she's lost all of it, which to her eternal. All of her siblings were older than her, so they all still speak various conglomerations of these languages.
Yeah.
But so I was surprised to hear that they just teach it straight in school, because my mom doesn't know it, but she must have been too young or too old.
Yeah, or I mean, it also depends on what you remember, choose to remember, right?
Yeah, that's probably true.
It sounds like your mom's story is a little more sort of like complicated than the average Danish immigrant to the U.S. Story.
Yes,
but
her dad was an ambassador, so she did a lot. Oh,
okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because otherwise, I could also tell you that it seems like that Danes, for some reason, they tend to, when they move to the U.S. as immigrants, they tend to just like ditch everything Danish and be like, okay, now we're it's fascinating. I've been digging into Danish migrant stories a little bit, and there's of course a couple of communities around in the US that are like very big on Denmark and Danish heritage, and I always find it incredibly weird to go to those places, because it's like this weird sort of like psychedelic version of my grandma or something like that I'm running into. But what I've found usually is that Danes, what they do when they migrate to the US in particular, and also Canada, is just sort of like slipping under the radar of any sort of like ethnic communities that they could otherwise attach themselves to, and just become sort of like generic American as quickly as possible. They just assimilate in.
They don't want to be viewed. Oh, that's interesting.
It's really fascinating, because when you think about it, there are like millions of Norwegians and Swedes that have migrated over the years. The Danes, a little less. I think it's around 500,000 from Denmark proper. But then if you count the parts of Denmark that were conquered by Germany in the middle of the 19th century, then we're actually also getting close to 1 million of people who are probably ethnically Danish, who have migrated, and so it's a similar size community as Norwegians and Swedes, but doesn't have the same amount of like sort of like interest in their heritage.
Yeah, cultural weight. Well, that's interesting.
How did you feel when you came over here, though? Have you assimilated fully, or?
I have in my own way, absolutely. Well, so when I came over here, I didn't expect to stay. I came here as an exchange scholar to work at CU Boulder, and my plan was to stay here for initially only for 3 years. There was 5 years, and in the meantime, I met my partner, and I was like, well,
I can't leave now.
Now we have a house and kids and everything. Like,
we love trapped you.
Surprise, you're an American now.
I because I go to like IKEA and I always get like Christmas feelings from IKEA, even like in the middle of July, just because the decorations remind me of how my mom decorates the house at Christmas.
I get it. Yeah, no,
She's
I
like,
get it.
we got to get the Julebakens out, and I'm like, okay, mom,
Right.
we got to get the Dollenhest, and I'm like, okay, mom, let's do it.
I go to. Thankfully, the IKEA down in Centennial here in the southern parts of Denver metro area has a lot of delicious food from Scandinavia.
Oh, nice.
I go there for the fermented fish.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's a hard no for me, Mathias.
I understand. I completely understand.
He has not assimilated his taste for fish.
Yeah. Speaking of fermentation, how about one of my favorite things to have on a cool or a warm day, I suppose, is mead, which I know is kind of a big thing over in the Nordic lands. If we're talking about pollinators and I guess Odin's mead of poetry, you mentioned something about bees before.
Yeah. So getting right into it. It's actually there's Snorri Sturluson, who's an Icelandic chieftain in the 1200s, writes Edda, which is one of the primary sources we have to Nordic mythology, and he gives us this very interesting story about how Odin gets the mead of poetry, and it
I
actually
thought,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry. The way I remember reading that is a snake, though.
There's a snake, there's a bird, there's a lot of funky things going on. There's
Mm.
also a guy who gets grinded into mead.
Yeah.
Well, he gets bled out. And this is where it gets really interesting. So one thing I want to preface this with is that he's an Icelander, Snorri Sturluson, when he's writing this down, right? That means that his knowledge of biology in general from the Scandinavian mainland is probably very limited, because Iceland is a different type of ecology, right?
Right. Oh yeah.
And it's a funny little side note. I mean, I was born in Denmark, but lived a good chunk of my childhood in Greenland, and
Oh, cool.
when we moved back to Denmark, I was like, what are all these things flying around? What is up with all these little insects? Like I've had like these on vacation, we would go to Denmark in the summertime, go to a quote unquote warm country for for vacation, and like I'd mess around in the woods and I'd see all these weird insects and freak out because I was just familiar with flies, mosquitoes, and a couple of spiders, and that's it, right? From Greenland. So that's also how you should think about Iceland.
Oh yeah.
Although Iceland has perhaps a little bit, a couple more insects here and there.
Well,
But
the primary pollinators in those lands are flies.
yes,
There's really not a whole lot other going on once you hit the more Arctic regions on the map.
exactly. Yeah. And so it's likely that a guy like Snorri Sturluson would not have been familiar with bees as actual bees. He had the concept, the word, but did not know what it was. So this is where we need to start with this story, right? So what happens? Well, according to his way of retelling the story, this begins right after the first war of the world, where the Aesir and the Vanir, these two divine groups, they have had a battle, and then they've settled a truce. Then they all come together and they spit in this giant cauldron.
As one
Yes, as one does. So this is
celebrate
actually
the truth.
So what we know about ancient techniques of making booze is that is actually a way to make fermentation happen.
I believe Japanese sake is made in a similar way.
Okay, I'm not familiar with sake.
Parts of South America, the indigenous people will spit into their fermented fruit drinks.
Yeah, that I've heard of that one before. Yeah, and we in Scandinavia, likely had a drink called kvass, and that was made in a similar way.
Okay.
You chew some kind of plant material and spit and mix it with probably berries or something like that. And this is really important for the story, because what the gods then do is that they create a man named Kvasir from this spittle, because why not?
Yeah.
And the next thing that he does is that he travels across the cosmos. It's sort of like told that he walks around and visits all the different beings in the world, and gathers a lot of knowledge. And he's apparently the smartest guy on the planet. And eventually he ends up with the dwarves. And the dwarves are chthonic beings. They live in the underworld. And so if you're a person, figure, character who comes from our level and you go down there, then you die. That's a thing, right? That's what happens in the underworld. So they decide to kill him, of course, and
Why not?
yeah, and then they drain
Came
his
to the
blood.
wrong neighborhood, friend.
They drain his blood and turn it into mead. And then a bunch of things happen that essentially results in the mead then being transported to the bottom of a mountain called Nordvig. And there it is guarded by this giant named Suttungur. His daughter has it there in the bottom of the mountain.
I love hearing you pronounce all the names, Mathias, because when I've read all of this in my head and I don't always know how the proper pronunciation. So this is a joy.
Yeah, it's nice to hear someone for whom like the name just easily comes, not someone being like and then Hemdall, he did it, and you know.
Well, a side note to that is that I'm sure there's a lot of Icelanders that are sitting there and like, oh, this dude has a weird Danish accent when he pronounces this stuff.
As Americans, we'll take it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's close enough, I guess. So next thing is that Odin realizes that this mead is now kept in the bottom of this mountain. And so he dresses up as a man named Bölverker, and he goes to Suttungur, and he says he sees the fields that lay around where Suttung has his hall, and he sees these slaves that are harvesting here, and then he goes over to them with a scythe. With a whetstone, so to sharpen their scythes. And he sharpens one, and he shows them how easily it cuts the wheat. And then he says the one who can get it, who can catch it will get it, or something like that. And then they all end up fighting each other over it, and then they kill each other. And then Suttung doesn't have any slaves to harvest his fields, and Odin then goes up to him and says, look, if you give me a drink of the mead of poetry, then I will do that for you. And he's like, okay, well, fine. And then he harvests for him, and then he comes back, and then Suttung is like, nah, not gonna do that. So right. So Bölverker here, he makes a deal with Suttung's brother Bögi to basically break into the mountain. So they go up into the mountain, they drill a hole, and Odin then realizes that Bögi is trying to trick him. And then he turns into a snake and slithers in through the hole. Then he gets into the bottom of the mountain. He spends 3 nights with Gunnlod. That's her price. And then he gets to drink the mead of poetry. And then he turns into an eagle and flies out. And then he flies all the way to Ausgarder. And Suttung, of course, realizes, oh, wait a minute. He's flying. There's this eagle flying. He's got to have been stealing the mead. So he comes after him.
He's been bamboozled at this
Exactly.
point.
Oh, no.
Now, when Odin then comes to the wall of Ausgarder, he spits out 2 portions in 2 different cauldrons, and then, as Snorri tells us, the last part he sent out backwards into Suttung's face, and
Rude.
yes, and that one is called the Skald of Fiflachlut, which means the portion that the bad skalds, the bad poets, will get. So, so there's also sort of like a a burn to any poor poet out there. You've been drinking literally shitty mead, I guess.
I would not have trusted someone whose name means bale worker. I feel like that was a bit of a tip from the beginning.
Yeah, no, it's like yeah, you should probably have thought of that, my friend. Okay, so how does this relate to bees? And this is where you guys probably know a lot more about all this stuff than I do. But I think we can see a little bit about sort of elements of beehives, patterns of bee behavior as well in the movements and actions of the characters in the story. I think
interesting.
This is.
I was going to say, if you imagine them shrinking rather than going to this other world, if they just shrink, suddenly that mountain could be a beehive, the hole could be the entrance to the beehive, but maybe that's my imagination going crazy.
No, see, this is where we're in that realm of like what is a legitimate interpretation of this, and what is sort of more imagination, creative interpretation, so to speak. As if anyone who has read my scholarship on Nordic mythology, my book on volcanoes in Old Norse mythology,
I have that book. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Nicely done. Yeah.
Then you also know that I do like to sort of like operate right there. In that intersection between legitimate scholarly interpretation and more creative understanding of the mythology, which
I appreciate that, because like you said, how do we don't truly know what the real quote interpretation is, because we didn't write the stories.
Exactly, and we should also just keep in mind that if thousands and thousands of people have been telling and retelling these stories over and over, applying them in their world, they must have had multiple uses, right? And I do get a little bit of flack from my peers in this field for having dealt with volcanoes in Nordic mythology, but I think at the end of the day, it's most interesting to see these stories in relation to the actual lives that humans have been living in different ecologies, right? Whether it's in Iceland, or it's in Norway, it's in Denmark, in Sweden, or elsewhere in Northern Europe, right? We should try to understand them in that context, right? And so
the ecology ran their entire existence. You can't
exactly right.
You are at the mercy of nature. Probably more so even back when these stories were written than we are now.
Absolutely right, and this is also why they would be relevant in that specific context, rather than something that like tells us a lot about like social rules or whatever else. Right? This is directly applicable knowledge to our lives right here, right now. That's how I perceive that.
Yeah.
As an art historian, my take on it is a little bit based in like, oh, I'm seeing something, so I'm interpreting from it rather than hearing or reading it. But it's often been my problem that they want to, the people that be, the systems that exist, want to try to explain away things. It's like, well, they did this. And I'm like, but why would they do that? People are people are people are people. And they pretty much have liked the same sorts of things for all time. We all like stories. We've all liked that our whole existence. We've all liked our families for the most part. Let's all talk about, so you can really take these core human moments and try and think about how history applies to those things. Like for me, it feels like they often forget the human element of history, and they're going straight for like, well, this is what I can see, so this is what I can take from it. And I'm like, yeah, but how would a person interact with that?
Well, that's academia.
Yeah.
That's academia. Yeah.
Maybe that's really my issue here. They're like, oh, well, they didn't have this such and such because we've never found that. I'm like, well, yeah, but like, let's use some common sense here.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
they probably did.
I think there is some reason to that. Absolutely. Like to sort of consider that, well, yeah, as you say, people are people are people.
Well, what are your bee interpretations then for that myth, Mathias?
Well,
what are you seeing?
What I'm seeing is what can be interpreted as the behavior of bees to some degree. As Amanda just pointed out, right? We have the beehive, we have the whole coming into the beehive. We have a queen in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Who guards the mead, which is essentially a honey drink, right? All you need is to mix honey and water, and then you hopefully get mead, or you get that shitty stuff.
Honey
that
plus
the,
water
the,
plus
the
time.
right.
We have the dwarves as worker bees.
Yeah.
In that area too, I think.
And if you come in, you die.
Yeah.
If you try to get in, we're gonna sting you to death.
You also have he's working in the fields as well, right? Of course the situation is that he's harvesting and he's killing slaves and all that stuff, but you could also see that as sort of a some kind of metaphoric relation to pollinating and
gathering nectar and
exactly right. And in the same way, this is actually the story with the highest death count in all of Old Norse mythology, except
more
for
so than Ragnarok.
Well, I was just going to say, except for Ragnarok. So aside from that one, this is the story where most people die. And again, that's also something that we see, right? And this is something that beekeepers would have known, that worker bees, they die. I would say that there's a lot that you can actually interpret in context of the behavior of bees, just by looking at where do the two things intersect here, the information from the text and what a beekeeper would have known back in the Viking Age or something like that. And this is where it then gets interesting, right? Because Snorri Sturluson comes from a place that does not have bees like that, right? And he would not have known all of that. So this could be a story that has been transmitted from the Scandinavian mainland at some point, and then lived in its form in Iceland, and then eventually taken form from the Icelandic environment in general, the animals that are present, the birds, and so on, right? And
right.
Right.
And we should also keep in mind, I don't have
snakes, but I've got worms, so I'll make a worm into a snake. I don't have bees, but I've got eagles, so I'll make it an eagle.
Yeah, there you go. And we can see that in a lot of storytelling. This is something that happens with many cultures and populations, that if they move from one location to another location, that new location is slightly different in different ways. There are new types of animals and so on. Older stories will be sort of reconfigured into this new environment.
Oh, I hear construction sounds, perhaps?
Yeah,
is that construction? Okay.
It's a saw in the background.
Okay, I couldn't tell if it was like a child's toy, but maybe that's just my brain filling in what I hear all day.
No problem, just so we know what it is. Yeah, that's really fascinating. What about so Snorri had mead, I'm assuming, right? Come in from the mainland, so he knew what that drink was. Is the mead of poetry, would that really have been referred to as mead, or would it have had a different name, given the lack of bees in Iceland?
That's what I was going to say, is there is a lot of cultural memory in the Icelandic material in different ways that remembers stuff from the mainland. For instance, in across the mythology, you can find references to a bunch of trees that have never grown in Iceland. So,
Wow.
but yeah, and so that doesn't mean that these Icelanders who were retelling the stories that they actually knew what an oak looked like, but they knew the word oak and they used it, right? So this is where there's a little crossover mixing in different ways. They have a vocabulary, but that vocabulary may not always correspond directly to the environment that they're in, right? That is the same for alcohol, right? So you have wine, beer, and mead that are sort of interchangeable. They
Okay.
they're and it's only high status Icelanders like Snorri Sturluson would have known what wine and mead were, right? Because he would be able to import it because he could afford that, right? The average Icelander probably didn't really know the difference, and maybe they didn't even really know what beer was either.
Oh, those poor guys.
Yeah, we have another story that actually seems to relate a little bit to the meat of poetry, where um, I think it's beer and then fermented fermented yogurt or overlapping in a very gross way. This is Ale Skallagrimsson, one of the sort of Odinic heroes, and he ends up like puking all of this this fermented yogurt out into the face of this guy.
Oh.
Yeah,
well, that's what happens when you eat fermented yogurt, right?
Exactly, but
comes back up.
But what it sounds like to me is that they were trying to get drunk off of that. So that just tells you that what they had to like deal with here. So yeah, in that sense, there's in Iceland there's like a cultural memory of a lot of things from mainland Scandinavia, but on the other hand, they don't have the means, resources, and biome to actually reproduce it in their immediate existence, right?
It's fascinating that they would still share these tales when they don't have this ecological link to the most of the flora and fauna that are mentioned within these stories. If we go back to mainland Scandinavia, the Nordic lands there, are there folk tales that do reference bees and other insects and their sort of usefulness?
We have a little bit here and there, but again, it's definitely not the primary focus of folktales in Scandinavia. Most of the stuff that I'm familiar with are actually in context of magic, different kinds of charms and that stuff. For instance, there are plenty of Danish charms that, or they're not just charms; they're also like prescriptions for what do you do in a situation where you're being chased by bees.
It's good to know how to react in that situation.
Yeah, but the solution for it does not seem like a good idea. So,
oh no.
So in Danish folk magic, what you have to do when you're being chased by a swarm of bees is you have to pick up some dirt and throw it at the swarm and then say, "Stay."
No, that will not work.
No, it's like really not a good idea, guys.
Have you tried this, Mathias, and does it work?
Yes.
I have not tried it. I assume it does not work. I have encountered a swarm of bees only once.
And that's why the bee death count was so high.
As an entomologist, ecologist, I don't think it would work. I think it would just make them angry.
That's exactly what I've been thinking as well.
It would briefly scatter them in a couple directions, and then they would immediately come back twice as mad. So I would not throw dirt.
Oh, now you're attacking us. How dare you attack us? So we were attacking you.
Exactly, right?
I had read something where ladybugs are associated with Freya. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I don't think
it was called like her beetle or something. It was like Freya's beetle.
Yeah, that's a very, very recent invention, probably on the internet.
We're gonna have to go back and edit our episode about ladybugs now, Kelly.
Yeah.
That's usually the case. A lot of this is the unfortunate thing about it. There's when it comes to Nordic mythology and what it takes an interest in when we look at animals and such things, it's snakes. Like they really like snakes for some reason. Then you have wolves. That's another thing that they're really down with. Bear here and there, horses and so on. They're much more sort of like focused on larger predators or animals that you will find on your farm in the North Atlantic. So not bees, because you would find bees on farms in, for instance, southern Scandinavia. And yeah, that's really it, unfortunately.
I guess it makes sense because either you're trying to grow it or you're afraid of it. Right.
Yeah. And the snakes, they sort of like have a curious status in all of this. There are so many snakes. They're like in so many different stories, and then also in different lists of like names for different types of snakes. This is something that Snorri Sturluson was also writing down. Again, a guy who would not be particularly familiar with snakes in his general sort of habitat, right? But he knows like all these weird names for snakes, and I think that has something to do with a very deep cultural interest in snakes. For instance, the look or so a certain kind of like piercing look that a hero can have is equated to a snake's eye as well. So there's something going on there.
Concerned about snakes. Why is that such a large part of their?
So I think you can go two directions with this. One is that we have a lot of influence on this material from Christian literature, and so that might be one option. But I think actually there's something else going on in this stuff. I think they just thought it was cool.
Yeah,
like it's just like there's just something about the way that they sort of like talk about snakes and this reference to having eyes like a snake that is like associated very specifically with high status heroes in Nordic mythology and the saga literature in general. It just seems like that was sort of like in a cultural context, we think this is cool.
That's like getting back.
Cool. I can't say that they're wrong about this. I mean, they don't have legs. How do they move? That makes no sense. They've got this forked tongue. No one else has a forked tongue. That's crazy. Like I don't blame them. And if you meet a snake, it's a problem for you a lot of the time because they're very deadly.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you do have there are adders, I think, in the north.
Yes.
So they're probably both real cool to look at, but also a little scary.
We have adders, and we also have I think two types of vipers, right? So there's like a couple of snakes that would be around in general.
I think you have a water snake up there too, which is harmless. I don't remember what it's called. It's probably like something boring like the common European water snake.
The typical water boy.
Yeah. But like Amanda was saying, people are people, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Everyone thinks snakes are cool. Okay, Derek is helping me out here. I was close. It's the European smooth snake.
Smooth snake.
And a European grass snake. So both boring names, but harmless.
The names in ecology are always like it's the lightning quick snap viper, or it's the smooth boy.
Yeah.
Oh, he's either awesome or he's just like, oh, there he is.
Really boring. But of course, I mean, this all begs the question: look, why isn't there more stuff in sort of the Nordic realm when it comes to insects? Because you can go to other places on the planet and you can find indigenous populations that have a lot of mythology and folklore around various kinds of insects,
Spiders are a common
Mm.
theme.
yeah,
Dragonflies, yeah.
yeah, and also stories that associate certain trees with certain spiders,
Hmm.
especially because you want to be aware of those spiders because they're deadly and they tend to hang out in this particular tree, that kind of stuff, right? And I think it's because our overall our insects are not that deadly in the north.
Oh,
Like
interesting.
there aren't that many that can sort of sting you or lay eggs in you or whatever and kill you, uh, and so you don't really need to generate a lot of you know stories around that and around the significance of them, because they're just like, oh, it's okay, so there's like a weird looking fly over here, and there's like
Yeah.
this wasp has a long snout of some kind, whatever, I'm gonna go in this direction now.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, right?
It's it feels to me like kind of one of those things where like it's so common that it's not worth talking about. It's like how in England there's salt and pepper, and then there was a third spice, and we
Mm-hmm.
can see that because all these sets are sold in threes, but no
Mm-hmm.
one knows what was in that third spice because it was such a commonplace item that no one ever wrote it
No one
down.
wrote it down.
No one wrote it down. So it's like maybe it was ginger, maybe it was sassafras. I don't know, because no one ever thought that was important enough to put in writing. So we just don't know. Even though it was only like 200 years ago, we have no idea. So,
Oh, that's funny.
bugs just might be one of those things that are like, yeah, there's some bugs. You know about bugs. We don't need to talk about it.
Well, it's interesting to me that so many other cultures have weaver stories, and they generally
Mm.
use spiders as an
Mm.
example. But we don't see that, I don't think, in Nordic mythology. The only weaving thing I can think of, and Mathias, correct me if I'm wrong, was the net that Loki was making before he became a salmon, and then I guess the weaving of uh, Loki's children, or one of his children, out of the other one's intestines to bind him. But
Yeah,
there's no
yeah.
like weaver
Loki
story.
gets up to some wild stuff, y'all.
He does, yeah.
Loki's out here having
does.
like 6-legged horse babies. He's wild.
Eight-legged, Amanda. He's
8-legged.
an
Yes.
He's an arachnid.
Yeah.
An arachnid horse. I'm into that.
Well, so this is the other sort of situation where we can look at things that seem to associate with a certain figure in Nordic mythology, and then suggest, well, maybe there's actually some references to spiders here in context of Loki. These are theories that have been posed by scholars as well, that Loki, and this also goes into a certain interpretation of the etymology of his name, that it could actually mean spider, at least in certain dialects in Scandinavia. And yeah, he's what is he? He is a figure in the mythology who is sort of like tied up in a bunch of quote unquote chains. That the term that they use in the Old Norse language is bund, and that just means bands, or, so that could be a lot of different things. And it's just sort of in the underworld, right? And yeah, that could be an image of a spider as well. It doesn't have to be sort of a dude laying there in chains, like we see it in romantic art in the 19th century. It could also be a spider. He is also the primary shapeshifter. He's the one who turns into a fly at one point in the story about how Brock and Sindri are making all the weapons that the gods have, and all the other cool things like Freyr's golden boar and a ship that can be folded into a little leaf that you could put in your pocket and all that kind of stuff, right? And he's trying to sabotage that situation, and then he turns himself into a fly and then nibbles in one of the dwarf's eyes to sabotage the whole thing. So yeah, he could also turn into a spider. I would assume, like that is very possible as well. And also something to keep in mind here is that in especially in the story about Ragnarök, as it is relayed in Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, there's a lot of talk about how the world essentially is held together with strings or bands or chains, and once Ragnar comes around, all those uh, chains, they break. And so there's like a constant reference to sort of like chains being broken or links being broken. And this seems to suggest sort of like a general idea that the world is held together by by these strings that are going out. And we see this reference a lot too. We see it in another poem about this hero called Helgi, where in the beginning the Norns, they fasten golden chains in the sky, and then they stretch them out over the lands that he will rule. And so this is a recurring metaphor and reference.
I mean, this sounds
And
like spider silk to me.
exactly right. So this is where the spider becomes a really relevant figure, I would say. And again, we don't see direct references to spiders, but we could assume perhaps that there is some underlying notion of this spiders making the webs. This is again something that Scandinavians would be familiar with, Icelanders as well. We have some really awesome spiders of various kinds, especially
all spiders are awesome here on the
yes,
podcast.
yes. But there's one that's sort of like very prominent in southern Scandinavia, where they make these big, really beautiful webs, and they sit in the middle of them. We call them, I don't know what they're called in English, but in Danish, the word that the name that we have given them translates to a cross spider, because it looks like it has a cross on the back.
Yeah, we have those here. They're imports.
Really?
We call them European cross spiders, and they're a form of orb weaver.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very thick.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I just googled it real fast. I recognize these guys.
Yeah, they have like a big fat body, and
Oh yeah.
What happens when you walk through a meadow in sort of perhaps in the early fall, you will see them, their big webs in the brushwood bushes, whatever is around, and they will have dew on them as well. So this would be
beautiful.
Yeah, it's really beautiful, and it's something that anybody would have seen back in whenever. I think we've only gotten to the point now where you're not seeing it that much anymore, because we're so busy farming and killing off insect life around us, right? So there are fewer and fewer of them. So this again, making such references to webs, making references to chains, links, and bonds, and all that stuff, I think would have easily generated such ideas in people's minds as well. And when you then have Snorri Sturluson, not Snorri, sorry, I always mix him up with like mythological figures. I was talking about Loki. It's because this guy, he was a bit of an Odin / Loki figure historically as well. So
his whole history is a bit crazy.
It is very crazy. I don't understand. Maybe I shouldn't say this publicly, because I should write that movie manuscript myself. But I don't understand why somebody hasn't made sort of like a Braveheart story about Snorri, because
I would watch that.
It's got everything. He's got like half of like how many secret lovers. I'm sure there's like 10 different women in his lives. He's got like his own worst enemy is his brother, and like it's
like Game of Thrones.
It is Game of Thrones. Yeah. So that's definitely worth a TV series or something like that. But
I know that within the greater pagan community, I've heard that Loki is associated with spiders for them, though I'm not quite sure whether it's etymologically a thing or.
I'm sure that there are people who associate him with spiders. It probably comes from that scholarly theory that has theorized that these are sort of more metaphors for spiders, which again I think is actually quite legitimate. when it comes to sort of the pagan community, you see a wide range of attitudes towards Loki. Like there's
Hmm.
some who perceive him as sort of like a Nordic mythological version of the devil,
Right.
slash Judas, and then you have all kinds of variations from there. There are also I know that a lot of LGBTQ plus people have sort of also latched onto him as a figure. I guess we should actually call him a they, because they're
Right.
switching
Yeah.
between genders and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So
Loki
that's
gonna do what Loki gonna do.
exactly
Yeah.
right. And so people have a lot of different ideas about him, and what that particular mythological figure is,
Hmm.
which I think is cool. That's exactly the kind of life a mythological figure, a deity, should have, right? Being able to sort of insert themselves in people's minds as in as
In
many
a modern
creative ways as
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
in a modern sense. Yeah.
I mean, I just
That's
keep
very
thinking
cool.
about you said that thing about him being bound in string, and I'm looking at this picture of this orb weaver spider right in the middle of this big web. If you imagine that the spider isn't the one in control of that web, it would be a
Hmm.
very captive position in the middle
Yeah.
of this big sticky net. Essentially, if they're not the spider in charge of that net, that could be bad for you.
Right.
But that's how they catch all their bugs and stuff. So
Hmm.
sticking him right in the middle of a big web, that's a very poetic sort of imagery.
Yeah.
I'm into that. I'm into that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's sort of like the other option here, that Loki can be a spider as well, and I think it's a very legitimate interpretation. I think it works out well.
Yeah.
And this is, when it comes to interpreting Nordic mythology in context of um, biology and geology, for that matter, what you need, and this is, if you're a listener and you're not familiar with the language, this is probably the component that will escape you. Uh, all these names that these characters have, they have meaning, right?
Hmm.
And meaning that can be interpreted either as analogies for something, or in a more direct sense. And we know that this was something that people did, because this is what skaldic poetry, the traditional Nordic style of poetry, relies on: creating additional meaning by making analogic references all the time, right? This is what a kenning is. So the most common form of doing that is, for instance, calling a ship the steed of the fish way, right? So a
Mm.
steed is something that you ride, right? The fish
Yeah.
way is the ocean, because this is where fish they commute, right? So that's the kind of stuff that they would do all the time, and this would also be embedded in names. And so when you go through the catalog of names in a story and you look at, like, what does that name mean, what does that name mean, and so on, you will then all of a sudden realize, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole another world of
There's a
meaning in
second
Yeah.
this.
story going on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a
Yeah.
whole nother illusion I've been unprivy to, because I've been reading this translation this whole time, where they just keep his name as whatever it was. They don't call him Spit Boy, but the Spit Boy is
Yeah.
important to know that he's a Spit Boy. It's important to know that he's a Spit Boy.
And it's through all this that, I mean, like we were talking about earlier with Odin and the potential beehive of a mountain, and it's all like read between the lines in
Yeah.
these things, right? Which is
Yeah.
fascinating.
And how much of this was oral tradition as well, where there's visual cues that you don't get unless you're watching it.
Right.
You
And
know?
I mean, all of it had a life as oral stories before it was written down, or most of it at least. Um, the Eddic poetry is, we can see that is all designed to be performed orally. We know that was the tradition behind skaldic poetry as well. And by the way, when I use the term skaldic and Eddic poetry, those are modern inventions. Like when we talk about those two different genres, that's not how they would have talked about it in the Viking Age. They would just have been talking about poetry, right? They would have different meters for different types of poetry, for different social situations, for different purposes, and so on. But they would just refer to it all as like poetry. And so these are like modern inventions by scholars that have been looking at it and been like, oh, this is that type of poetry, that's that type of poetry, we have this and this literature and so on. But that's really our modern tendency to categorize and more than anything else. But yeah, they would have performed all of this orally. The sagas, these long extended narratives that were written down at one point, they would have performed those in some form or other in an oral setting as well. And once they became literature, it would still have been a situation where somebody would have sat and read, and people would have been listening to it, and there would be some level of theatrics going on as well.
Right.
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of visual cues that we're missing, and oral cues as well, right? That we just don't have any longer.
It's fascinating how deep all of these layers really go. Do you have any other examples of insects in charms, or
let's see.
Is it just the throw dirt at bees?
That's the one that comes to mind. I'm sure I'm probably forgetting a couple here and there. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't really. Like, I wish there was like a sort of like a folk tale that really gives us. But there aren't really any like traditional ones that I can remember that are like, sort of hints at a deep cultural relation to any insects, unfortunately.
Right. Well, if you happen to think any others, we're happy to have you back.
Yeah.
On a future. Or, I mean, you want to go, you want to work together on a little paper, my friend, about bugs and Nordic lands. You send me a little note.
Yeah.
I'm sure
that
I
could be
can
fun.
help with that little collaboration.
Yeah.
We are just a little over an hour. We don't want to take up too much of your time. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about while you're here with our captive audience?
Oh, that's a dangerous question to ask because I never shut up.
Yeah. You were talking about snakes a minute ago, and I just realized that like there's that whole scene in Thor Ragnarok where Loki turns into a snake and then stabs Thor. So that now is on brand that he would turn into a snake. Because
right,
he turned several times. MC.
Yeah, I mean I think it's always fascinating to look into what kinds of animal life is actually present in a mythology, and also what role does it play in context of these anthropomorphic figures that are also mentioned, and play an important role. And I think when it comes down to it, if we look at the archaeology of Viking Age Scandinavia, what we can see is a lot of flight. There's a lot of imagery of it's not just birds. It's also like human.
Loki's got some shoes, right?
Yeah,
that's shoes. Is that not quite?
That's Snorri's interpretation based on his knowledge of Greek mythology.
Snorri.
Crossover.
There's a lot to be said about what he actually did to the mythology.
Because there's a lot of that, right? A lot of our traditions are still, we're all kind of playing this game of telephone with our own cultural backgrounds of like, and the Christianity comes up, Christianity goes down.
Snorri was a Christian,
whatever.
so
right. Yeah. So like, I gotta convince these people to adhere to Christianity, I'll start pulling things from what they know and put it into mine. Oh, okay, this Christmas tree, it's for Christmas now. So you can just forget about anything else to do with this tree. It's Christmas now. I'm taking it. And like a bunch of our traditions are that sort of stuff. At least, to my American experience is like, just I'll take a little of this, take a little of that, take a little of this.
So
now everyone agrees it's palatable now.
So actually, the way that we should approach an author like Snorri Sturluson is that we should understand Christianity as the dominating scientific paradigm of his time.
Mm.
So he's doing more than simply just saying things like, we should believe in God, or that kind of stuff. He has actually refashioned Nordic mythology, these traditional stories that have been told by individuals living in an entirely different world than, a Christian world. He's taking these stories and then he's putting them into a framework that is defined by Christianity. So that's why Edda begins with God created the world, Adam and Eve, then the flood. Like, that's what he starts with. Keep that in mind. And then he gives us a very complicated explanation. Then he gives us a very complicated explanation for how there can be people who believe in other things than Christ and God. Because this is a big philosophical problem in the medieval period. Because, the assumption is here that God created the world and humans were created to believe in God. So why is it that there are humans that don't believe in God, right? We don't get that. And this is where he then latches on to old Greek explanations for, Hellenic philosophers had multiple ideas about where does religion come from and all that stuff, right? And the one that's favored by medieval Christians is euhemerism, where it's essentially, the explanation is that once upon a time there were these really cool people who did really awesome things, then they died, and then their descendants started basically worshiping them as deities because they'd forgotten the name of God. That's the explanation, right? This goes back to Euhemeros, who was a Greek philosopher who once theorized, I think it was like 400 something BC or something like that. Maybe it was a little later. But sometime before Christianity, theorized that, deities are just humans that have lived once, and then we ended up venerating them, which, to an extent is also true, because you do see different types of non-Christian traditions doing that, right? Somebody becomes elevated to the state of deity posthumously, right? So he wouldn't be wrong in that sense, right? But yeah, so
it's fascinating how this gets all twisted and changed, and how much history have we lost because of this, right?
Right. But it means
no culture is standing on its own. They're all influencing each other, and we can't really unknot those strings of where they start to overlap.
Exactly. But it also means then that when we're reading these stories, we need to keep in mind that they were intended to be fashioned as stories about humans. And next layer is, of course, that they came from Troy, right? Snorri Sturluson tells us that they escaped after the Trojan War.
Oh, Snorri, what are you doing? What are you doing, buddy?
So he's also telling us that all of these stories are actually allegories of what happened during the war at Troy. So when Thor is fishing for the Midgard serpent, that's actually Hector being coaxed out by Achilles with the head of some dead guy named Volocrontis, whose name we don't actually know. We don't actually know where that comes from, that name. But so, yeah, Snorri is doing a lot of funky stuff with the mythology.
Producer Derek is calling it Aeneid fan fiction.
Exactly, that is very much what it is.
It's a lot of fan fiction going on in that era. A lot of I mean, like, people want to harsh on stuff. Dante straight up writes a fan fiction about himself going into this self-insert fanfic. He gets to meet all his heroes, and they're all like, "Wow, you're a cool dude, Dante." And he's like, "Thanks, I knew."
Well, speaking of fan fiction, because we are sometimes a comic book podcast.
Occasionally.
Occasionally. Mathias, what are your thoughts on Marvel Thor and that world? Does it make you angry?
Where does it? Yeah.
Does it make me angry? No, it doesn't make me angry.
How many angry sighs have you done? You're just like, all right, I guess we're doing that. All right. Mm-hmm.
No, so I mean, I don't get angry about people creatively using Nordic mythology. This happens in all cultures and in Scandinavia as well. Like, I grew up with this very popular comic book called Valhalla, and all the characters, all the figures of Nordic mythology are like, pretty silly caricatures, right? And so that's, we're very used to that in Scandinavia, I would say. The Marvel universe is interesting in the sense that, here it has all been interpreted as like aliens, essentially.
Right.
And that's, I would guess, sort of like a modern theory on where gods come from, that they're aliens. It goes back to some of the early New Age stuff, the idea that there is like an ancient super people living somewhere. This is where Marvel gets a little problematic, because they're actually borrowing from old, very racist theories.
Right.
And that's
Tolkien problem.
The Tolkien problem. Yeah, that's where I have like maybe some reservations, because if you go back to the 19th century, there's the idea that these Aryans were an ancient super race is sort of circulating a lot, and it goes into science fiction. What was his name? Edward B. Lytton wrote a book called The Great Race or something like that, where he theorizes that there was this ancient race living in Hollow Earth. And actually, that book then became a lot of weird Nazi theories later on.
Yeah.
Boy, it always does.
Right?
Yeah. There's been kind of a resurgence of like, it's not been good. It's not been good.
Yeah, and this is where there's hints of that in Marvel's versions of Nordic mythology as well, which I think they should have weeded out before they made these very popular movies.
But they're fun. I think in the end, the movies are fun, and no one should get
a very
too
straightforward version of
mad
like,
about
he's
it.
his dad, he's his mom, that's their sister. Like, we're not going to get into how complicated that actually is. So.
Right.
Well, Mathias, thank you so much for coming. Can you tell the people where to find you?
Yes. So the people can find me on Instagram if you just put in my name, Mathias Nordvig, Mathias Nordvig. And that would also be my website. You can just write my name.com and find my website and figure out what I do otherwise. And of course, you should listen to my podcast, the Sacred Flame podcast, which you can find on pretty much any platform that has podcasts available.
It's great. I've listened. I'm up to date on it, and it's wonderful. So
awesome.
There's my recommendation, folks. Give it a listen.
It's sort of my I'm sort of trying to extract contemporary life philosophy from Nordic mythology, and also my knowledge of history in different ways, fusing those fields and then saying, oh, well, here's hopefully a solution to you of some kind.
It's great. You do a nice job of, even like you said with your books and your research papers, you've kind of got this different take on stuff, and it's not strictly the usual academic take. So it's fun.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then
We'll put all that stuff in the show notes too, so folks can find you.
awesome.
Thank you, really, thank you so much. This has been very fun, very fun. I hope you had a good time.
Very fun.
I had a great time. Thank you so much for inviting me on here.
Bugs Need Heroes is created by Derek Conrad and Kelly Zimmerman, hosted by Amanda Niday and Kelly Zimmerman. Bugs Need Heroes is produced and edited by Derek Conrad. Our music is Ladybug Castle by Roll Music. All character art by Amanda Niday. Got a bug question? Email us at bugsneedheroes@gmail.com. Check us out on bugsneedheroes.com for the visual companion to our episodes with the artwork of the bug-related heroes. We also have an Instagram, Twitter, and subreddit under the Bugs Need Heroes name. Thanks for coming by. But the Spit Boy is important.